It's endlessly repeated, and it means the dice is thrown. Julius Caesar is meant to have said it as he stood on the banks of the Rubicon, although actually, a bit like with Et tu Brute, it's one of those famous phrases associated with Caesar that in fact Caesar said in Greek.
Oh, so it's all wrong?
It's not all wrong, but it's one of those stories that has been endlessly repeated and endlessly mythologized.
In 200 yards, bear right.
The phrase crossing the Rubicon has. It's something that has resonated down the ages.
So tell us the story of Julius Caesar, why the Rubicon River.
It takes us back to the last anguished years of the Roman Republic, and Julius Caesar is probably its greatest general, and he's gone off to become governor of Gaul. He's divided Gaul into three parts. He's crossed over to Britain.
In 500 yards, bear right. Then in 150 yards, keep to the left.
Huge number of enemies anyway. And these enemies are worried about Caesar's ambition and brilliance, and they're afraid that he will put the entire Republic in his shadow. And so they are manoeuvring to bring him down. And the salient point in this is that Julius Caesar, as governor of Gaul, is immune to prosecution. But when he lays down his governorship, he will then be liable to be brought to trial. And so there's a kind of echo there, I suppose, of sort of practice in, say, Italy or France. There was sort of Chirac or Sarkozy, both of whom were granted immunity while they were presidents. Slightly similar. And Caesar is aware of this, and so what he wants to do is to lay down his governorship and then immediately take up another office. And so he has supporters in Rome who are making his case, pushing for him to be allowed to do this, and he has enemies who are trying to stop him. And eventually it's the enemies who prevail, and they force Caesar into a corner, and they present him with an absolutely excruciating decision. And his two options essentially are to lay down his governorship, to go to Rome, to obey the law, but to risk complete ruin despite all his incredible achievements, or to keep his legions and to cross the Rubicon. And the Rubicon serves as the boundary between Italy and his province, and it is absolutely forbidden by every sacred law of the Republic for a governor and his soldiers to cross the provincial border. And so Caesar, when he realizes that he's going to have to make this choice, sends his one of his battle-hardened legions up to the banks of the Rubicon. He then follows, and he stands on the bank and he gazes into the currents, and he is said to have pondered and mused on this terrible decision, and then he says, "I lay down to rest," crosses the Rubicon, and it's not just Caesar's career that is affected, the entire course of Roman and ultimately Western history is affected as well. And so that's why crossing the Rubicon has come to serve as the exemplar of every major decision that once taken cannot be withdrawn.
And we know that he didn't make that decision until he was standing on the banks of the Rubicon.
That's how it's presented. I mean, Caesar himself never actually mentions crossing the Rubicon, interestingly. This is something that is told about him. And I suspect Caesar was a man who knew his mind and was accustomed to striking with immense speed and decisiveness. I very much doubt that he paused a moment. I think he'd made his mind up already.
He knew. But
it was a sort of dramatic moment, and Caesar was a great one for the melodramatic gesture.
Why is the Rubicon River in the news at the moment?
A trial is being held. It's a sort of informal trial. It's being held in Italy to decide which river should actually be defined as the Rubicon. And the one that your listener crossed was defined as such by Mussolini, who was a local and was very, very interested, for all sorts of obvious reasons, to identify himself with the strong men of Roman history. And so he pushed for this one particular river to be defined as the Rubicon. But we don't really know which one it was, and there are two other very good candidates, and so they're meeting in Italy today to try and argue it out.
So in this mock trial, they're going to come up with a definitive verdict?
No, they won't, because there is no definitive verdict to be had. We simply don't know. We know roughly the region. We know that it must have been relatively shallow. We know that it wasn't very large. We know its approximate location, but I don't think we can definitively decide.
Crossing the Rubicon, the phrase, is very much a part of the public imagination. It's often used. David Cameron talks about it when he was warning of the dangers of press regulation.
Yes, which again is sort of interesting, because it's that idea, again, of liberty and order. And so the principles, again, were sort of quite familiar. It works very well for that.
So it still has a real strength in political terms.
I think so, but also, of course, in personal terms as well. It's one of those sort of images that of course works for the field of high politics and national drama, but also, we all face moments in our life where we have a Rubicon to cross or not cross.
Bear right, then in 150 yards, keep to the left.
And Mick Jagger, the song Streets of Love, he talks about crossing the Rubicon.
Yes, and Yeats alludes to it as well in his poem The Long-Legged Fly, where he imagines Caesar in his tent, pondering whether to cross the Rubicon, and his mind moves upon silence like a long-legged fly.
Author of The Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic, Tom Holland.
Someone else who's crossed the Rubicon is the voice of this week's Youth News Bulletin.
Manchester City, 7. Southampton, 3.
Our very special collection of listeners' sentences of news is read by the new voice of the classified football results on BBC Radio.
I thought there was blood on the glass roof, until I realised I was sharing my plump August Kent cherries with a rat. My wife encouraged me to buy a silly, impractical and expensive car. She's full of